if you can tell me a little bit about your organization.
Yeah, Mosaic is a nonprofit that offers wraparound services to the survivors of human rights abuses and crime. And so it was started in 1993 by our current executive director, who is a refugee from Vietnam, as a mental health services facility for refugees. And as needs kind of became more identified, the organization grew. So originally it started off providing services to refugee survivors, and specifically their mental health services and case management. And then needs in terms of domestic violence were being identified. So domestic violence case management program got added in. We are one of the first agencies in the nation to work directly offering services to trafficking survivors. So that department got added on. Eventually, the legal department got added on in 2002. And so we've kind of expanded from just being a mental health service provider to kind of providing services for any kind of victim of crime on the spectrum. And then we also expanded to having our own domestic violence and trafficking shelter. So we house 44 beds that serve domestic violence survivors who are escaping their abuse, or trafficking survivors who are escaping their trafficker.
Okay, that's a pretty good program. Very interesting. Just like I said, which is why we're very intrigued by it, why we want to, expose it. So the first question I want to ask you is, what is your first thoughts as you meet the victims for the first time?
So it's a little different. When we meet a survivor, they usually end up going through at least 2 different stages before coming through us. 1 or 2 stages. So they might either go in the shelter and then get a case manager, or just have a case manager and then come to us. So when I meet one of my clients, they have already left the abuser, but they have just recently left, or it could be 8 months down the road, and that's when they've decided they want a divorce or child custody or a protective order. And so when I first meet the client, I often just try to assess where they are in terms of when they've left and how vulnerable they are. So my first thoughts are just, is this person comfortable? Can this person share their story? And so I tend to just make sure the client is comfortable in telling me their story. I try to see their body language when they're talking, when I first meet them, to see how comfortable they're going to be even answering questions. And so my first thoughts are just, do they look comfortable? Do they want to talk to me? How are they going to talk to me? What do I need to do to make this place more open and comfortable for them?
Well, it's pretty open and comfortable. I'm feeling very, not, nervous or anything like that about this interview. So I got that down packed. My second question is, do you notice any behavioral patterns or changes in victims?
Sorry, I'm sorry, I don't know what I did in my phone. The reason I need to look.
Okay, so my second question is, do you notice any behavioral patterns or changes in victims?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate in that when I work with a client, I usually have a client for more than just a few month period. With case managers, their job is to help them access social services, kind of get them on their feet, but oftentimes they have the client for maybe a 2 to 3 month period. Mm-hmm. With me, I usually have my clients anywhere from at minimum 2 months to maybe 3 or 4 years. So I actually can see a significant change from when I first got them to when they end up departing from our office. So for example, I might get a client who's barely speaking English, and by the time our relationship is over, they might be speaking pretty complete sentences in English and can at least understand me without an interpreter. So that's pretty fantastic. I get to see a client when they first have left, so they're, they don't have a lot of resources, they're very flustered, and they're trying to become empowered, trying to figure out how to be on their own for the first time with their children, and so they're really nervous, really scared, trying to find their independence, but very dependent. And by the time they end up leaving my office, they tend to be far more independent, kind of figuring their things out on their own. They usually end up having a job by that point and are pretty much thriving in the life that they've created for themselves and their children. So a great example would be, we had gotten a client I guess 5 years ago in this office. She originally sought us for immigration relief. And so my supervisor had taken her immigration case, and then we identified that she needed family law help as well to get divorced from her husband. So I took the family law case, got her divorced from her husband. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was they had a house together, and the judge ordered it to be sold, which is what we wanted, because they already owned the house, so there was a ton of equity in the house.
Yes, and so lots of money.
And so after it was sold, the title company was supposed to send half the check to her and half the check to him. And the title company sent one check to him with both their names on it. And he went to the bank and cashed it. The bank shouldn't have cashed it because it had both their names on it. And even if he forged her signature, it was over $10,000. So the bank should have asked for her to be there. They didn't. He ended up running off with, like, I think $65,000. But I ended up working through her case. So when she first came, she was undocumented and was working under the table. By the time I finished working her family law case, she had already gotten a green card in the United States, had an employment authorization document, so was working, getting paid more than minimum wage. By the time I finally finished her family law case and got her the money that he ran off with, she ended up becoming a manager for 3 different franchise locations, and was making a 6-figure income, and went from literally working $5 under the table to then not able to speak English to us and always having an interpreter, to me never having to bring an interpreter in with her to court, and her being able to survive and thrive and provide for her child to go to college. So I got to see kind of the scared, and then I got to see her be independent and be able to provide for herself and her children.
Good.
Yeah.
I like that story. Okay, so my third question is to you. How do you control your emotions?
There are days you just can't. There's actually... You learn coping mechanisms. So I got my master's in social work, and I was a social worker before becoming a lawyer. So you learn coping mechanisms, kind of, what there are things that you need to do. There are times you need to step aside. We have a very open office, and so the good thing is if we hear some tough news with a client meeting, or there's just, we go through a bad story, after that meeting, we have a very open office that we can just sit and talk to one of our colleagues and kind of, talk through why we're frustrated about that meeting, or why that meeting is upsetting, or why we're upset. And then you have to develop kind of positive coping mechanisms outside of work, right? So you have to figure out what is going to make you not take that back with you. And so oftentimes people don't stick around long term because they can't figure those things out for themselves, or they develop negative coping mechanisms, and so they end up getting burned out. The best way I've found is to surround myself with people that are going to be a good support group, which I have fortunately found. And then the other is what I have found has been really helpful for me has been working out. And so I either go running or boxing. And both of those things boxing's been great because I can just imagine the abuser as the boxing, like the punching bag. And so then I can box, and that makes me take out a lot of my anger in a positive way.
Okay. As a matter of fact, those two things are some of the things that we talk about that people do to let out anger or frustration when dealing with when coping mechanisms, when dealing with stuff like this. My fourth question is, what are the red flags you want to watch for in victims that concern you?
Yeah, so credibility is a really important thing in the legal department. It's a little different at Mosaic. So case managers have a very different relationship with the clients than legal does. So the case managing department is different because case managers are like social workers. You don't question whether the client is telling the truth or not. They've identified themselves as a survivor or victim of domestic violence, and you provide them services. The legal department is different because in the legal department, credibility is important because I have to take you to court, and I have to put you on the stand, and I have to make sure you're not perjuring yourself. And so inconsistencies in the stories are really big red flags for me, and pretty much kind of anyone in the legal department, because if a client is telling me one thing and then 2 weeks later tells me something completely different, that's a big red flag for me. And it's for me to figure out why they're doing that. And if there's not a legitimate reason, then that's a huge red flag. And one of the biggest issues we've generally had here one of the biggest red flags in the legal department are inconsistencies. So, for example, I had one of my first clients when I first started this job. She told me that her case she had a different case. She had a case with the DA's office for a protective order against her husband long before we ended up getting her case, and they had gotten her a protective order and a child custody order that kept dad away from the oldest child because dad was that abusive. And then eventually she went back to dad, as most victims do. They say on average a victim returns 7 times before they finally leave the abuser. So she went back to him, ended up getting pregnant by him again, and so now they had 2 children. I had to go to court for her case because she wanted a new protective order because he had threatened her again. So she ended up getting pregnant with a second child, but left him and had stayed away from him. And he ended up finding her one time, threatened her, and her protective order was going to be expiring. So she was scared that once that expired, he'd come find her. Mm-hmm. So I ended up getting her. I was going to court to get her protective order again, but I would have to put her on the stand. She had been seeking therapy, and so I talked to her counselor, and her counselor said, well, I don't even know if that second child is his, and I was really concerned by that because my client was adamant that the second child was his. Mm-hmm. And the counselor was telling me these stories, and I'd gotten the counseling notes, and that was a big concern to me because of that and that's a big red flag, right? Like I filed a divorce case, and I filed a protective order case on the fact that this man is the father of these 2 children. Mm-hmm. And so then I reached out to my client, and she just starts crying. And I was like, and I just asked her, I was like, hey, I'm a little concerned. And I got this message from your therapist, and I don't know what's going on, and I need to know what's going on. Why does your therapist think that the little kid's dad isn't your husband? And she starts crying. She's like, I was told by CPS if I go back to him, they're going to take my children away. And so when I got pregnant by him, I couldn't tell my therapist because she would have to report it to CPS, and CPS would take my child away. Oh. And so her not telling me was actually completely understandable. Mm-hmm. And when you're a victim, you don't know if you can trust everyone. So even though as an attorney, my job is to have your relationship with me is confidential insofar as we're not going to put particular things into court and put you on the stand. The things you tell me in this office are confidential. And while she knows that, she doesn't understand that because of what her conversations with CPS were. Yeah. And so then she was honest with me, and we had no problem after that. On the flip side, I've had a client lie to me several times, and I've caught them in a lie several times, to the point where they perjured themselves on the stand in front of a judge, and I knew they were perjuring themselves, so I had to withdraw from that case. Yeah. And so the red flags are often usually with credibility more than anything else, and the other red flag is the lack of communication. So when a client disappears, that's you always wonder why the client has disappeared, and more than often when they have disappeared from communication with you, they've usually gone back to the abuser.
Thank you very much for that knowledge. My 5th question is, do you have your own counselor or somebody that you speak to talk to about these experiences?
I do not, but I have reached out to Helping Our Helpers, which is a organization that actually provides therapy. I think 8 free sessions are to people that are working in this kind of field. Okay. Almost everyone in the legal department at some point in time has actually sought therapy, though. And a lot of case managers have other program directors. We're very much so open to the idea that this work is really hard and really tough and can be mentally exhausting. And you don't want to take what you're hearing and have it affect your personal life. So everyone in this organization is very open to the fact, and a lot of people in this organization have sought therapeutic services to help kind of deal with these emotions from an objective third party.
And you said it's called...
Helping Our Helpers.
Helping Our Helpers.
Yeah.
Okay. And you said your backup is that you have an open office where you guys can talk to each other. So there you go. My 6th question is, what keeps you in this field?
I always knew I was going to do this kind of work. This is one of my dream jobs, and I was fortunate enough to get it right out of law school, or pretty quickly out of law school, maybe a year out. It's that gratifying feeling that you get knowing you've helped someone, but it's not just that. It's giving voice. The reason I stay is because I'm able to give a voice to someone who doesn't have one. The clients that we have here are literally at the bottom of the totem pole, and they're the most disenfranchised. You're talking about undocumented, limited English proficient survivors of domestic violence and crime. So they literally have no voice. Literally and metaphorically, right? Like they've had power and control. Someone had power and control over them, and then they oftentimes can't speak English, and they're undocumented. So they don't have kind of a voice in the system. They feel that the system isn't going to help them because of all of these negative factors that they tend to believe are or these factors that they tend to believe are negative. And so what keeps me here is being able to give that voice back to them so that they're able to thrive, and that they're able to learn that just because they have this situation happen, it doesn't define their long-term ability to survive.
Okay, thank you. How did you get into this field?
I always grew up knowing that I was going to work with people and helping them. When I was an undergrad, I went to a Jesuit university, and the Jesuits' motto is "Men and Women for Others." So you go to college to get an education to give back to people. The education you're getting there is literally so that you can serve other people. And I knew that I was going to be a lawyer since I was 7. But it was at undergrad where the defining moment happened that I want to do public interest law. And so I got my master's in social work instead first because I wanted to understand the psychosocial aspect of working with survivors, and kind of just working with individuals that are going to be coming through the public interest sector of the legal side. So when I was getting my master's in social work, after I got my master's in social work, I was an independent domestic violence counselor and advocate in London. And so I'd moved over to London to be a social worker, and they actually had this specialized domestic violence court in London. And I saw what they call them barristers, these attorneys, they're kind of serving domestic violence survivors, and I would go to be supportive because I was their social worker. And I was like, oh, they have law that allows you to work with domestic violence survivors. I need to do that. And that's kind of where my passion kind of was affirmed when I was a social worker, that, I'm going to do law. This is the law I need to do. And then I kind of paved my path in law school to do it that way.
Okay, good. How did you like London?
Huh?
How did you like London?
I loved it. I mean, if they didn't renew my visa after a year, but if they had renewed my visa, I probably would have been there longer.
I'm planning to go to Australia after this. Let me see. My 8th question is, did you have any personal experiences that caused you to become interested in the field?
Yeah. So I'm a South Asian first generation woman. I'm a Muslim woman as well. So I grew up learning women oftentimes, or I grew up seeing that women are constantly oppressed. I have 4 sisters. So my dad lived in a household full of women, and my dad was very, very traditional. And then he had to change kind of his thought processes as they moved to the United States, and they were raising 5 women. I'm super first generation in that I'm literally the first one born in my family in America. My 3 older sisters were born overseas. Every one of my relatives prior to me was born overseas. So I was the first American born in the family. And so I saw and heard comments my female relatives would make about what women should be doing. Then I had this weird warp view in school where I saw these females being very active. And it was just this very weird place that I was in, where I had relatives saying, no, you need to grow up. And not just relatives, but people I was exposed to in my community that would say, you are going to grow up and you're going to have to be home to make sure there's food on the table. And you're going to have to cook and clean. And then there's this other side where I was seeing you can be whatever you want to be, and you can have a job, and you don't have to be home to have a dinner on the table at 6 p.m. And so it was this weird world I felt like I was living in as a child. But that kind of shaped me to figure out who I was as a person. And it made me realize that some of the things my relatives and other people in my community were saying to me, they were only saying it because they didn't know they had another option. And it was partly because you saw, and having traveled to South Asia, and I saw the oppression there, right? And then it made more sense to me. And so I realized what I want to do is fight that oppression. If you want to go home at 6 p.m. and make sure there's food on the table, great. But I want that to be your choice. I don't want that to be that you have to do that because you're a woman and you're forced to do that. If you don't want to do that, great. But it needs to be a choice and not a forceful decision by someone else outside of yourself. So it was having been exposed to that kind of made me want to work with women specifically and empower women, because for me, I had to push a lot of doors and barriers to get kind of where I am as a female. And so I wanted to give back to that type of community and that type of work.
Okay, most definitely. I like that. Um, has there ever been a case that you've come that made you too emotional, that you became too emotionally attached to?
Um, um, yes and no. So I do a little bit of immigration law, and the hardest cases for me in immigration law are sexual assault of minors. And so I had a sexual assault minor case where we had said we weren't going to get involved in their family law case, but that client just, I felt terrible for her. And so I ended up getting in their family law case, even though it's not typically the type of case I would take. I was pretty invested in it though, and I would say that those are her case, and then those types of cases are the ones that are the hardest for me. So I end up taking them back home with me more than I tend to want to, and so it's I can't say there's one specific case that I've gotten super emotionally involved in. The case that I have the longer, I'm more invested because I've been in them longer, so I want to make sure the outcome is great. And I I'm pretty I'm pretty. I think what happens in this office is once you get too emotionally involved, you end up leaving. It's because once you've gone past that barrier in the legal side, it kind of starts affecting
Your work.
your not just your work but your mental stability in wanting to stay. You end up getting burned out once you've become too emotionally invested, right? So I've been fortunate that people in this office can keep me in check to not get emotionally invested in that capacity. That I'm emotionally invested to the degree that I need to be, but I'm not overly, that it's coming home with me every single day. So I don't think I think I've gotten close to being there, but I haven't gotten there. And it's really just trying to learn what the difference is between um, being emotionally involved and what the differences of being their legal advocate are. And you can be emotionally involved if you understand that at the end of the day you're their legal advocate, and that's what you need to do for them. That you can't do your day to day. You can't make the client do things that they're supposed to be doing. So, for example, I knew an attorney, not in this office, but another office. Oftentimes we get supervised visitation ordered by the judge so dad can't have the kids unless he goes to supervised visitation center. And there's an attorney I knew at another nonprofit who would take the client to drop off the kids to supervised visitation center, and that's just really muddling the lines of being an attorney and being just an advocate and being their friend. And you kind of have to figure out how to just keep that line as I'm your attorney and I'm going to support your legal options. And you know, that attorney felt like, well, if she can't get to the supervised visitation center, then dad's going to say she's not following the orders, so then she's going to get in trouble. But what unfortunately happens is you're almost enabling the client to not figure out her independence. And so, yeah, it might take an hour and a half to get the kids to the supervised visitation center because you have to get on a bus. But the client has to learn that on her own. And if you're picking up the client and dropping the kids off and then waiting you're putting yourself in danger. You're also putting the client, you're not empowering the client. And what's happening is it can be very dangerous. And so it becomes hard, right? And so I don't think that's happened to me yet. I've had situations where I've been scared because the abuser on the other side is pretty scary. But I haven't had a case where I've gotten so emotionally involved that I haven't been able to focus on the end goal.
Okay. The 10th question. How do your cases impact your personal life?
I think I'm more guarded. I will say that I've become more guarded in life in general. It's funny. I've always known that women need to watch out. Women need to be more cognizant of their surroundings because, unfortunately, we live in a society where women have been they haven't been empowered, and then they can't wear whatever they want without having to be told that they're asking for it, or there's a victim blaming game there. The Me Too movement's kind of pretty fantastic